So today, as I said, we're going to start off on these lessons about vulnerability, and I want to start at the beginning with what I'm calling Vulnerability 101. What it is, what it isn't, and why it's so important. And so as ministers do, I was researching about vulnerability, and I ran across this story that I thought it was interesting, and it illustrates the topic of vulnerability pretty perfectly. And I know sometimes you think when I'm going to tell a story, it's going to actually be a joke, but it's not a joke. This is actually a story. A mom tells the story actually about how her daughter, Anna, hosted a sleepover for several of her friends, including this particular child at the center of the story named Maddie. And the mom writes this: Maddie's mom called me in advance to let me know that her daughter would be bringing along her lovey, and was worried that the other girls might tease her for sleeping with a ragged blanket, the same blanket that she had slept with for 10 years straight. And it had moved with her from her crib to her toddler bed to her big girl bed, and the blanket had taken long car rides with her. It had soothed her when she felt lonely or hurt or afraid of the dark. And when this girl was around people who knew and loved her best, she was never afraid to bring the lovey out into the light. But as she grew older, she began to keep it hidden from anyone else. She couldn't quite put a finger on the reason why, the mom said. Why did something she loved so much feel like it had to be hidden? Somehow the blanket had become a bit of a secret, and admitting that she slept with a lovey made her feel vulnerable and maybe a bit ashamed. So as night came, I dimmed the lights in the family room where Anna and her friends would sleep, and all the girls snuggled under their blankets for a late night movie. And I was about to push play on the remote when I noticed that Maddie, she wanted her blanket. I could see she was like fighting a quiet battle on her insides. This battle was about the risk of vulnerability. If she's like most of us, Maddie was asking herself the most paralyzing question in the universe: what will people think of me? She made her choice. I watched as she walked back into the bedroom, unzipped her bag, and quietly pawed through her belongings to find the love-worn blanket. And from my seat in the family room, I saw what happened next. Maddie walked back into the room and had her blanket tucked under her arm, and one of the girls saw what she had retrieved from the bag. Maddie had been found out. "What's that?" asked her friend, pointing her finger at the lovey. And I was so proud of Maddie, because here's what she did next. She lifted her chin and she mustered her voice, and she took the first step toward authentic relationship. She sat cross-legged on the couch and told her room of friends the truth. She told about how her mom's friend had made the blanket for her when she was a newborn, how it had traveled with her on 100 car rides, how she had lost it once in the park, and how it fell apart a few years ago, and she had to have her grandma sew it back together, and she showed everyone the long stitch that looked like a scar. And everyone listened. No one laughed at her. No one judged. And the most beautiful thing happened next. One by one, the girls each pushed back their covers, walked into the bedroom, and unzipped her own duffel bag. Out came the ragged blankets, a bear with a missing eye, a plush doll. Every girl in the room was hiding a secret lovey in her bag. That I call the night of the great unzipping. Each girl dragged her own lovey into the living room, and they took turns telling their stories about loveys lost, loveys loved, and loveys found again. And everyone slept better that night because someone had the guts to go first. So I love this story because it truly is a beginner's lesson in Vulnerability 101. And I see the moist eyes back there because we can relate to that feeling. And I love what she points out as the most paralyzing question in the universe. What will people think of me? And I think the big thing we've got to figure out is how much weight we give to that ever-present question, what will people think of me? And it's a universal question. but it affects some people more than others. And I think a strong spiritual grounding is helpful, very helpful, in relieving this question's power over us too. So I'm going to give you some definitions of vulnerability. One is by a marriage and family therapist named Sherry Foos, and she writes this: vulnerability is when a person willingly takes the risk to reveal their emotions and weaknesses. Brene Brown, the great teacher of our day, I truly believe she is a phenomenal spiritual teacher. She said it indifferently. Vulnerability is a state of emotional exposure that comes with a certain degree of uncertainty. It involves a person's willingness to accept the emotional risk that comes from being open and willing to love and be loved. So why do you think our little Maddie in the story was willing to take the emotional risk of exposing her need for her lovey? I think she was brave enough to take that risk because, one, it was very important to her, and she was willing to love and be loved. She sensed that she belonged in that group, and that belonging gave her courage. Willing to love and willing to be loved, that is something worth looking at from a spiritual perspective. So could it have turned out differently for Maddie? Absolutely. Sure. Part of being vulnerable is that risk part that both the therapist and Brene Brown pointed out. That risk of being open. Maybe others won't accept you or will choose to use the information. This is the big one. They may use the information you have shared to try to shame you or hurt you at another time. But the path of vulnerability is the only path you can take to true expression of yourself. So I want to look at another lesson in this. I like to say that the stories that are told about Jesus illustrates him to be, for me, just a great teacher and a great example of how to live in the most holy and enlightened way. And Nadia Bolz-Weber, if you know her, I know some of you do, she's an extremely progressive Lutheran pastor. She happens to live in Denver, Colorado, and I love listening to her, and I love reading what she has written. And we might be miles apart theologically, right? But man, she's spot on sometimes. And she wrote a book, and it's called Shameless. And in it, she wrote this about one of the Jesus stories, and I'm reading Nadia Bolz-Weber. She said, after the resurrection, Jesus presented his wounds to his grieving friends. John 20:20 says, Jesus came and stood among his disciples and said, peace be unto you. Then he showed his hands and his side. He did not try to hide the mark from the spear, and he did not wear gloves to conceal his injured hands. He was shameless, like a middle-aged woman with stretch marks in a swimming suit on the beach. And in the same way, Jesus was unashamed of his wounded body. He was also unafraid in his whole life of the human bodies he encountered in his ministry. He never recoiled from disease and in deformity. We've seen how he reached out his hand to touch the bodies of lepers, the blind, the possessed, those who were wounded physically, spiritually, and socially. And he knew that in his resurrection, he would be known by his brokenness and scars. There's a whole lesson right in that one sentence. He would be known by his brokenness and scars. But isn't that true for us as well? We can only really know and be known when we show how life has marked us. I never really feel a connection to someone until they have shared with me the lumpy, broken, and even petty parts of themselves. Our pain and failure, the things that we so often try to hide, the things that we create, the things that create shame, the things that scar, are what gives us texture. And without texture, there is nothing for others to connect to. Nadia Bolz-Weber, take a breath. I love the reminders that Reverend Nadia shares with us, and they are for all of us. The takeaways for me from that article she wrote, or that paragraph she wrote, is number one, when we are unwilling to be vulnerable, we often reject others who are inherently vulnerable, the broken, the rejected, the injured, the struggling. As if being in the company of those people would somehow highlight our own woundedness, our own shame would be triggered by being amongst the vulnerable. And number two, my second takeaway is vulnerability is the path to connection, because we only feel a real connection when everyone shares their real selves, as she says, lumpy, broken, and even petty parts of ourselves. Jesus and little Maddie did the same thing. They walked amongst their friends and said, here, see my soft spots, see my scary experiences. I am not ashamed, and I ask for your acceptance, and I give you peace. And what happened? Those who were shown circled around and connected with them in a meaningful, transformational way. And that is what each one of us is trying to do. Get connected and stay connected. We're all trying to be living a life, yes, that truly and freely expresses our deepest sense of self. The truth is, we're all tired of hiding our lovies and our scars. We're tired of it. And our lumps from the world, those things that give us our uniqueness, the ways that we feel scared, or the ways that we have found comfort in our fears. You know, we all want to be loved for who we are, not some manufactured version of ourselves that we fabricated to gain acceptance. It's risky. But, Brene Brown says, staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience a connection. And that's what we all crave, is connection. And it's probably why you're here. You're here. Because, you know, when we see people come into our community, we often wonder who's going to stay and who's not going to stay, right? Who's going to move on? And I think the people who stay, look around, you're here, are those who've invested in the connection through vulnerability and through authentic seeing and being seen. And it's sometimes hard to connect on a Sunday morning. You know, sometimes I like to say the Sunday service is like a drive-through restaurant. You know, you drive through. You come, you say hi, you consume some spiritual food and the music and the message or whatever, and then you go back out into your life. You throw a little money at the person behind the window, right? But the real dining experience happens outside of the Sunday morning celebration service. The true connection occurs when a person, you know, claims this as their space to be real. True connection happens out there in the fellowship hall. It happens in a sacred cup discussion. It happens when you share your story in a class. It happens in a pool or on a hike or on a play. That's where that true connection happens, when you finally get into your swimming suit in the middle of a community party. That's when connection happens, right? Connection happens when our stories are told and our stories are heard. Connection happens, y'all, when we unzip our duffel bags and we take out our lovies. Connection happens when we share our road to losing ourselves and then finding ourselves again. And it takes vulnerability, because we have all experienced judgment of others. And not only toward ourselves, but from ourselves, on that very path of humanity to spirituality, back to humanity. We've all felt it. So maybe most of you know that I served as a minister at a larger center in Atlanta. And I was responsible one time for creating a women's retreat. And so the point was so that all the women in the community could experience a real connection together. And I knew the path to connection went straight down the field of vulnerability. So very early in the retreat, it was right after breakfast actually, I led them in a circle experience. So that all the women stood in a circle. And I started asking them different questions. And if that question was a yes for them, I invited them to step into this circle of vulnerability, this circle of connection. And I started with easy stuff, like step into the circle if you need a cup of coffee every morning. They stepped in. And I told them every time they stepped in to look around, to know they weren't alone in that. And so step in if you're trying to lose a few pounds. Step in if you work every day. Step in if you're retired. So I was wanting them to see that they were like everybody else. And then I took the questions deeper. Step in if you're a mother. Step in if you are grieving the loss of a child. Step in if you are a widow. Step in if you're facing right now a serious health diagnosis, whatever it was. Every time I asked the women to step in, they were looking around and realizing, I'm not alone. Because what happens is we think we're the only one with a lovey zipped in our bag. We think we're the only one. But we can look around and realize we're not alone. We have sisters all around us. Not one single question that I asked, not one. No matter how obscure the question was, did only one woman step in. There were at least two for everything. It was a powerful morning. And vulnerability led us there. And that group of women were never the same again. It was awesome to watch. So maybe it's time for you to step forward into vulnerability again for yourself. Vulnerability is what is required for us to explore the depths of who we are as a human being, but also as a spiritual being. Even when we don't know what we're going to discover in the depths when we go down there, right? Vulnerability is what's required for us to introduce those depths to the people around us. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, writes, every one of us has in back of us the potential of the universe. There is an irresistible potential pressing against everyone for self-expression. If we listen, we shall hear it, not as a voice, but as a feeling, as a divine urge to express. So maybe you're feeling that divine urge to express, to be yourself, to allow the potential of the universe to show up through you. Perhaps it is to share your talents, to join in deeper conversation, to reveal your truth in search of connection, to never let any human experience you have had give you the false impression that you are uniquely broken and you are not supposed to express your soul to the world. So vulnerability is the willingness to risk and face that uncertainty and explore who you are on a deeper level. And as a path to connection, let me share what vulnerability is not. I've told you what it is, let me tell you what it's not. Vulnerability is not oversharing, dumping inappropriate amounts of information, personal history, emotions, and stuff just with wild abandon, right? It's not being vulnerable for the sake of saying, see, look at me, I'm being vulnerable, I'm sharing all my stuff, right? Often that kind of sharing is done to elicit a certain response or an outcome from the listener. Brene Brown cautions, I only share when I have no unmet needs that I'm trying to fill. I firmly believe that being vulnerable with a larger audience is only a good idea if the healing is tied to the sharing, not to the expectations I might have for the response I get. Think about that for a second. That's a tricky line to walk, right? We all know how uncomfortable it is, though, when someone's just kind of oversharing inappropriately. The tone and the motive of vulnerability, in the sense that I'm talking about, is one that is born from a desire to fully express oneself for the purpose of authenticity and creating a healing connection. Vulnerability is not weakness, but instead a conscious choice to express thoughts, feelings, and desires in a way that serves to nurture an authentic life, kind of to set yourself free, so to speak. So now that we know what vulnerability is and what it's not, I want to share a very personal experience of vulnerability. So most of you know that Terry and I began seeing each other during the pandemic. She doesn't know I'm telling this story. During the pandemic. And just to clarify, when we started this, there were no restaurants open. There were no concerts to go to. There were no movie theaters. No way to go on like a typical date. There were no friends around to distract us. And quite frankly, there was no way to get like a good housekeeping seal of approval on each other because there was no good housekeeping around, right? So we were stuck with each other. And we had to depend on our own sense of judgment, which is a tricky thing. Our own sense of judgment as to whether or not this relationship was going to be worth pursuing or not. So we had endless conversation. Endless. Quite frankly, some of the early ones were 6 feet apart outside, right? Because we were in this whole pandemic thing. So we talked about easy topics. We talked about our histories, our likes and our dislikes, kind of the usual conversations. But one day we were sitting outside on her lanai, and I asked a doozy of a question. I asked her, what is the one thing you don't want me to know about you? And as that question is coming out of my mouth, there was a part of me saying, are you crazy? Because if she answers that question, she's going to ask you the same question, right? But what happened was the most beautiful thing. And while I won't share what we each shared, what I can tell you is that from that question on, we both knew that we could be 100% vulnerable with each other. Laying your biggest, most vulnerable piece of information out on the table in such an important relationship and having it lovingly picked up and pocketed as a treasure, that experience is a transformational moment. But you know what else has been life-changing? Neither one of us have ever mentioned those subjects again, not even once. Vulnerability is sacred. My last quote from Brene is this one. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. Those are some big words. I understand why you want to keep them, because that is why vulnerability is so important to us as a community. Vulnerability is a building block for a thriving and healthy community. It calls us to come together to create safe spaces here and cultivate safe relationships in which vulnerability can thrive and grow. Not only do we create these spaces here for ourselves, we create them for each other so that others can come and do the same thing. We are all alike. We are all like Maddie and her lovey. We're all like Jesus and his scars, like the middle-aged woman with her stretch marks, like every woman who stepped into that circle of connection so long ago at that breakfast, like Laine and Terry revealing big pieces of personal information. We all want more love and understanding. We all crave a sense of belonging. We all want places where we can live courageously. We all want to experience empathy for ourselves and to express empathy towards others having similar experience. We're all learning more about how to be spiritually grounded. When we are in a place where we can be vulnerable, we have hope. Derek and I sang that song. In this very room, there's enough hope, right? Hope that we are lovable. Hope that we are not alone. Hope that life is getting better and better every day. That's why vulnerability is important to us as individuals and why it is important in our spiritual home. And as I said, vulnerability is not weakness. It's about showing up and being seen for who we really are, for how our lives have really been up to this point. The call today is to begin to examine areas in our lives where we've been resistant, for whatever reason, to step into that circle of vulnerability. If I would think about what question I would ask, we were standing in a circle, step in if you are blank, that you would hope I didn't ask that. That's something to look at. Let's continue to foster this space of radical acceptance as we dare to reveal ourselves in this circle of connection. Vulnerability is the path to living big and free by unzipping our duffel bags together and saying, this is me, love me as I am, and trusting that we are surrounded by a community who does just that. Look around. You are not alone in this circle. And so it is. And so it is.